The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series on the American Bicentennial. To help celebrate the 200th anniversary of our nation, the AEI has gathered some of our country's leading scholars and educators to share with us their views on the American Revolution and how it still affects us all today. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a part of the AEI's continuing effort to open the major issues of our times to serious discussion from several points of view. The AEI is a nonprofit institution located in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture takes place in the Benjamin Franklin Room of the State Department building, located in the section of Washington known as Foggy Bottom. The State Department is a fitting location for our lecture, which is entitled Foreign Policy as a Dimension of the American Revolution. It will be delivered by Charles Burton Marshall of Johns Hopkins University, who once worked at the State Department as a member of the policy planning staff. The State Department is one of the most important of all our government's operations. It is in this building that the men and women who shape our foreign policy and our relations with other countries ply their trade, the delicate business known as diplomacy. In the main lobby of the State Department fly the flags of some 127 nations. Each flag represents a country with which the United States has diplomatic relations, and at times each flag can also represent a major headache for the professionals who guide our foreign affairs. Also of interest in the State Department lobby is this huge relief globe of the world, often used as a backdrop for national television correspondents when reporting from the State Department. In the courtyard of the State Department stands a sculpture by artist Marshall Fredericks entitled Man in the Expanding Universe. The sculpture is dedicated to all members of the armed forces and the Foreign Service who have given their lives in service to the United States. The State Department stands in an area filled with monuments to America and great Americans. Just across the Potomac's tidal basin is one of the most spectacular, the Jefferson Memorial. And just a few blocks away from the State Department is that favorite of Americans everywhere, the Lincoln Memorial. The towering Washington Monument can be seen from almost anywhere in the downtown section of the nation's capital. And from there, the view extends to the Capitol building itself. But the State Department must concern itself with people, not with monuments. The embassies of dozens of nations are clustered nearby in the section of Washington known as Embassy Row. When you see an automobile in Washington with license plates labeled DPL, you know immediately that the owner is one of the foreign diplomats with whom our State Department experts must deal. The embassies here range from huge residences that were once the private homes of Washington's elite to modern glass and steel buildings like this one built by Brazil. To hastily acquired temporary headquarters like this hotel recently taken over by the People's Republic of China. Inside many of the embassies, great native art treasures are proudly displayed. Here in the Iranian embassy, the Persian room symbolizes Islamic architecture and provides excellent examples of the 16th century craftsmanship of the area. The beautiful mural and tile work were handcrafted by Iranian artists and took several years to complete. The room displays both old and new Iranian art and is used as an after-dinner reception area for guests at the embassy's party. Many of the diplomats who attend those parties are part of tonight's audience at the State Department, where they are gathered to hear Dr. Charles Burton Marshall discuss American foreign policy as a dimension of the Revolution. Dr. Marshall is introduced by Ambassador Carol C. Lays, Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs.
It is for me a particular pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Burton Marshall, who, besides being an old friend and colleague, is Professor of International Politics at the School for Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University. His most important works have been The Limit of Foreign Policy and the Exercise of Sovereignty, as well as a book on the Cold War and a concise history of the Cold War. Dr. Marshall, when he finished his education at Harvard, taught at Harvard, and then he came to Washington and served on the House of Representatives Committee of Foreign Affairs for quite some time, and we were fortunate enough to have him join us then in the Department of State in the policy planning section. Therefore, it is a particular pleasure for me to be here tonight to welcome you, and more particularly to introduce our speaker, Professor Marshall, to tell us about the American foreign policy, the dimension of the American Revolution. Professor Marshall.
Secretary Lace, ladies and gentlemen. The ship Lively brought to Boston in early May of 1774 details of the British Parliament's response to the Boston Tea Party 5 months past. Boston was to be devitalized, stripped of status as a colonial capital, its customs house removed, its commerce interdicted. The news spread post-haste. By this time of the month, 200 years ago, was known from New Hampshire to Georgia. Through a dire spring, in summer, retribution would be compounded. Massachusetts would be reduced to a royal satrapy. Its colonial charter rescinded. Elections and town meetings deauthorized. Quartering of troops on the municipalities renewed. Venue shifted to the Crown's advantage in criminal cases linked to civil resistance. Parliament in London, in unison with an adamant King George III, meant business. Their will, both would not scruple about overturning any recalcitrant colony's internal arrangements. That was the message conveyed. Those events of 1774 are recalled for commemorative purposes, in part, also and more to the point, for their significance in great developments pertinent to our topic. They marked a stage on what John Adams called the real American Revolution. A revolution not to be pinpointed in time, a revolution, as Adams said, effected before the war commenced, consisting of a radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people. The recounted events signified a beginning to the end of illusions under which the restive colonies had been pressing their grievances. As one sees in retrospect, though this point was not yet apparent to the colonists, the spring and summer of 1774 prefigured eventual and inevitable repudiation of British rule. The revolution registered and explained to a candid world in the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 2 years later. The roots of confrontation lay in a multiplicity of circumstances, but the clash, when it came, was rationalized in terms of the two irreconcilable sets of constitutional propositions. The word Constitution and what it meant were, as Bernard Byron has observed, centrally important to the colonists' position. Their entire understanding of the crisis rested upon it, he says. So strategically located was this idea in the minds of both English and Americans, and so great was the pressure placed upon it that in the end it was forced apart along the seam of a basic ambiguity to form the two contrasting concepts of constitutionalism that have remained characteristic of England and America ever since. Theoretically, a point made by Charles Howard McIlvaine a half-century ago, the American Rebellion might be backdated to 1648. In fact, the clash remained latent and revolutionary resistance was out of mind so long as parliaments asserted supremacy over and within the colonies was only declaratory and ritual. The occasion for division and the stimulus for rebellion grew out of the 7 Years' War and the operative changes which it brought in respect of the British governing role in America. The 18th century's most pervasive and costliest conflict entailed large deployments of British forces to save the colonies from extinction. The mother country's power became, as never before, a palpable presence on the American scene. The operations of war incurred great expense, constitutional theorizing aside, sharing the resulting financial burden was not unreasonable, and the portion allocated to the colonies was equitable. Should the king's subjects everywhere get the benefits, but only those in Britain pay the bill for security? The tax resistor answered, first, with an elusive distinction between external and internal taxes, the one sort legitimately assessed, the second wholly unacceptable, and then with the denial altogether of Parliament's authority to levy taxes. Both sides seem to have argued from a misplaced tradition. Each strove for something new in a guise of vindicating something established. The British for an imperial commonwealth, centrally dominated as never before except in ritual forms. The resistors for a league of equals beyond experience and even beyond their articulation. As Randolph G. Adams has written, America after the French and Indian War was a nation which had outgrown its old political garments. To its clamor for new institutions necessary to fit the new conditions, the restrictive policy of the old colonial system brought only more swaddling clothes. In an ironical reversal of arguments of a sort recurrent in politics, it fell to successive parliaments, preponderantly of Tory stripe, and to a king of similar outlook to apply, in trying to enforce taxation within America, the Whig postulate of Parliament's pervasive supremacy. The tax resistors, Whig in persuasion and adopted name, relied on old Tory themes of royal prerogative. No diminution of prerogative was wished as the Continental Congress assembled to coordinate resistance in face of the coercive acts of 1774, sought to assure George III. That best of kings, as he was called, was inaccessible to arguments based on distinctions between kingly office and parliamentary scope. For the time being, tension between throne and parliament was minimal. In form, the king was subservient to a parliamentary majority, while in substance dominating it through manipulative patronage. 4 years later, resistance would make its point. The king would declare fit for bedlam anyone upholding taxation for America. Besides retreating on taxes, Britain would offer the colonies representation in Parliament and promise amnesty for rebellion. Too late. For by then, the fighting begun in 1775 as constitutional resistance to assertedly unconstitutional acts had become, as perhaps it had to become, irreversibly a revolutionary war. And the rebelling colonists had contracted with Britain's inveterate enemy, France, to persevere until British acknowledgement of the independence of the United States of America.
We're listening to Dr. Charles Burton Marshall discussing American foreign policy as a dimension of the American Revolution. In just one moment, Dr. Marshall will continue. Although it probably would come as a surprise to many of our founding fathers, the largest and the friendliest of all foreign diplomatic headquarters in Washington belongs to Great Britain. Standing in a characteristically English setting, the embassy, with its red brick walls trimmed with white stone, its steep roof and towering chimneys, recalls an English manner of the Queen Anne period. The building was completed at a cost of about $1 million. Outside the embassy stands a statue of Sir Winston Churchill. He flashes his familiar World War II V for Victory salute to the passers-by on busy Massachusetts Avenue. The statue was erected after Congress voted Churchill American citizenship. Back at the State Department, Dr. Charles Burton Marshall is discussing a quite different attitude between England and the United States that existed some 200 years ago.
The standard ingredients of war were already at hand in mid-1776. The Declaration illuminated rather than established that circumstance. It defined the issue at stake, not a mere matter of tax jurisdiction, constitutional procedure, or proper allocation of authority, but the prizes of statehood and sovereignty. The Americans assumed among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station. No longer would London be the determiner and medium of their relations with the great globe. They claimed full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. The vicarious inequalitarian devices of empire must be shed. In their own way and own right, the Americans thenceforth must participate in the nexus of diplomacy. Another word, by the way, not yet in usage at the time, and therefore not explicitly in the Declaration. To acquiesce in a settlement of the war, providing anything less, would amount to defeat. The Declaration was an exercise in psychological warfare, though that key word, psychological, also had not yet entered the language. As such, it aimed for preemption of the moral high ground in hope thereby to generate resolution on the patriot side and to rally support wherever else possible and to contribute to discomposing civil will within the adversary establishment. Terms of sublime innocence were chosen to depict every premise, interest, purpose, and mode of conduct on the patriot side. The British brethren were appealed to in the name of their native justice and magnanimity and the ties of our common kindred. With a bill of 28 accusatory particulars, which took up about half of its 1,337 words, the document portrayed George III, so recently the best of kings, as an agent of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Hitler in the dock at Nuremberg could scarcely have been more vigorously arraigned. The Declaration, a more important point, was a bid to make victory a plausible outcome by attracting allies and encouraging a benign tilt on the part of government standing aside as neutrals. These aims went hand in hand with the aspiration for independence. Without drawing in allies, the aspirants could scarcely expect to escape the eventuality of having to settle for an accommodation within the British system for any purpose less than detachment from the crown, with corollary effects of damaging British power and prestige, and of opening up market opportunities through abolishing Britain's monopolistic control over their external commerce. The Americans could scarcely hope to induce third-party interposition by Britain's strategic rivals or even benevolence on the part of Britain's competitors in trade. Beyond making a case for severing old political associations and for making war, the Declaration also articulated an array of assumptions and precepts concerning the nature, norms, and values of political existence. In these respects, too, it had and it still has a bearing on international affairs, though that word international was not in the text, for indeed the word in 1776 was still a dozen years short of becoming invented. In these respects, the Declaration looked to the conditions of peace. Before examining the relevant thoughts, it is pertinent to say just something about the style and sources of the document. Judge Santayana called the Declaration a salad of illusions. Gabriel Chenard's appraisal of a half-century ago, the Declaration, with its sentences so balanced and so rhythmic that no artist in style could improve upon them, it rated as the first and to this day the most outstanding monument in American literature. Yet John Adams likened the Declaration to a juvenile declamation. Late in life, Thomas Jefferson, the principal author, found heavenly comfort in its abiding appeal to his countrymen, whereas Timothy Pickering, a reluctant third in the succession of United States Secretaries of State, wished it to be consigned to utter oblivion for its polemical excesses. On balance, the ayes have it. Moses Taylor's estimate, written in the late 19th century, is a representative judgment. Jefferson, he said, gathered up the thought and emotions and even the characteristic phrases of the people for whom he wrote, and these he perfectly incorporated with what was already in his own mind, and then to the music of his own keen, rich, passionate, and enkindling style, he mustered them into that stately and triumphant procession wherein, as some of us still think, they will go marching on to the world's end. Amid the plethoric triviality of contemporary political discourse, one reads the document with envy for a time when statesmanship was capable of elegant language and knew how to unite history and literature. Jefferson turned to neither book nor pamphlet while drafting the Declaration. That's what he said. We should believe him in recalling the rush job half-century later. He named Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Sir Philip Sidney as sources of ideas in his mind, adding an etc. to the list. Expositors who have analyzed the text with a thoroughness befitting exegetes of Holy Writ have found hints of the Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, James Wilson, George Mason, Tom Paine, and dozens more in its nuances. Jefferson surely had read them all. His sensitized mind, in Carl Becker's words, picked up and transmitted every novel vibration in the intellectual air. Jefferson had internalized that great age's multifarious literature of reason, felicity, harmony of interest, moral order, natural liberty, progress, and vaulting confidence in the clarity of moral principles and in the making of new starts. The Declaration was and is resonant with ideas from the Enlightenment. Conceivably, the claim of independence could have been based on simple pragmatic considerations. The outworn British imperial system simply was not working. With the Americans out rather than in, it would be better for all concerned. Such a case invoking practical particulars would not have been in the style of the times. Instead, the argument must be founded on such universal abstractions as inalienable rights and the law of nature and nature's God. The focus of principles and abstractions adduced was self-determination. The main reliance was a concept of social contract in line with Locke's late 17th century Whig theory perceiving government as an instrument to ensure people's pre-existing rights and preconceived purposes, empowered by people's consent only for those ends and subject to overturn for failing or exceeding them. The case to be made must be large enough to engross all humanity. Vast premises were mentioned as truths held to be self-evident. We think, therefore, it is. More forthright Cartesian self-assertiveness would be hard to imagine. The U.S. Constitution, then still a dozen years in the offing, would be of a different order. The national leadership echoed in the Constitution would have become less hortatory. The content showing recognition of a need for more than abstract good ideas in order to maintain a going concern would be matched to the needs of a nation, in Alexander Hamilton's phrase, likely to experience a common portion of the vicissitudes and calamities which have fallen to the lot of other nations. An important lesson regarding linkage between independence and capacity and will to meet obligations would be mirrored. Keeping attuned to a supposed harmony of interest was not enough. The nation must put itself in position to attend to its own concerns more effectively. No language of implicit of a world mission would be offered in the Constitution. The Constitution would be intent to perfect the union of states. It would be concerned with justice within, not as a spontaneous abstraction, but just as a function of authority. The tranquility asserted as an aim would be domestic tranquility. The common defense to be worked at would pertain to security for a national base. The welfare postulated as an end for policy would be that of the generality of Americans. Liberty's blessings would be coveted for ourselves and our posterity. Domestic concerns they all would be.
Dr. Charles Burton Marshall has been discussing this nation's foreign policy at the time of the American Revolution. In just a moment, he will continue. According to those who concern themselves with such things, the French ambassador's residence is considered to be the most elegant in Washington. The French residence is a rambling stone and brick building of neo-Tudor design. In the rear, an oversized garden commands one of the most spectacular views of the nation's capital. Even before France bought the building in 1936, the mansion was famous as the home of multimillionaire John Hayes Hammond, who had interest in some of the world's richest gold and diamond mines. The leading figures of Europe and America were often guests in Hammond's mansion, and when the French bought the building, the tradition was continued. France has long been a major concern of Americans' foreign policy, a topic under discussion today by our AEI distinguished lecturer, Dr. Charles Burton Marshall.
Now, the two founding documents, the Declaration forming part of the poetry as distinguished from the logic of politics, has proved to be the one of greater effective appeal, pertinent to the conduct of foreign policy. As Dexter Perkins has observed, American statesmen have believed and have acted on the belief that the best way to rally American opinion behind their purposes is to assert a moral principle. In doing so, they have often gone beyond the boundaries of expediency. The Declaration has offered a ready catalog of relevant apothegms and analogies. The practice of invoking them has not been a matter of mere rhetoric, of propaganda, of humoring preconceptions, of guessing what will go over with the public. Ideas explicit or implicit in the Declaration have endured as legitimizing concepts in the national psyche. Presidents, their spokesmen, and their principal advisors have been wont to return to such ideas as a way of validating policy undertakings in their own minds. Thus, in a manner unparalleled, our 20th century conduct in world affairs has been accounted for in 18th century frames of thought. Similarly, a proclivity for galloping abstractions, in Charles Frankel's phrase, has been stimulated within what are known as intellectual circles. Yet little of analysis about international politics and foreign relations is to be found in the Declaration. The lack is consistent with Locke's philosophy, which, though full of ideas about harnessing government domestically, recognized the great role of contingency in handling externalities. What is to be done, I quote Locke, in reference to foreigners, depending much upon their actions and the variation of designs and interests, must be left in great part to the prudence of those who have this power committed to them, to be managed by the best of their skill for the advantage of the Commonwealth. The pertinence of the Declaration inheres mainly in the fact of the nation's coming into existence on the basis of a concept of self-determination asserted to be universally applicable. That concept itself could scarcely be said to have been subject to much analysis in the Declaration. With that concept, as an Englishman once remarked, the United States wrote, if not the death sentence, then at least the epitaph of empire. Self-determination has become, in Raymond Aron's phrase, the political absolute of our time, a development for which the American instance has served as precedent, if not cause. The concept was ambiguous at the moment of origin. It remains so still. The Declaration uttered the notion as a justification for war and a condition for peace, as a claim to national autonomy, and as an invitation to intervention. When Woodrow Wilson at Versailles invoked self-determination as a basis for universal peacemaking, his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, warned that he was establishing a rationale for innumerable wars to come. It was a prophetic judgment. Both sides in every conflict since World War II, as I recall, have championed the idea. Its ambiguity as between an interventionist and a non-interventionist doctrine has perhaps never been better demonstrated than it was unconsciously by the late President Lyndon Johnson in his State of the Union message 8 years ago. He described support of national independence, the right of each people to govern themselves and to shape their own institutions, as the most important principle of our foreign policy. He added, for a peaceful world order will be possible only when each country walks the way that it is chosen to walk itself. Then he summed up, we follow this principle abroad by continued hostility to the rule of the many by the few. A few auxiliary elements of the Declaration may also be cited, for an analytic reader might wish for more prescient care in the wording of some of the aphorisms. For example, I wish more explication had been supplied for the key word rights, invoked in support of a number of desiderata. Something said by Oswald Spengler is pertinent. Rights result from obligations. An obligation is the right of another against me. I am skeptical of a tendency prevalent in our times to apply the word right as a label for every preference in national or international affairs, for where every goal becomes expressible as a right, then the extent and tightness of the pattern of obligation becomes total. Grace and counterpart gratitude are obviated, and civil existence takes on a tribal sort of rigidity. I wish Jefferson had methought his stipulation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes observed, the most fundamental of the supposed pre-existing rights, the right to life, is sacrificed without a scruple not only in war, but whenever the interest of society, that is, of the predominant power in the community, is thought to demand it, every law abridges liberty. As for the pursuit of happiness, was realization or merely endless quest assured? I remember H. Rap Brown's statement made in the paper once that he was tired of the pursuit of happiness. As far as he was concerned, it was up to the governor to take a prisoner and turn it over to him. Now, we go on. Was the happiness meant in the sense of good luck, pleasure, or spiritual composure? Whatever the meaning of the word in the context of natural rights is anomalous. Here too, Spengler is relevant. Happiness, he said, is unexpected, rare, unlikely, brief, and blindly appreciated. The less men have brooded about the nature of happiness or their right to it, the happier they have been. I should prefer some exposition of the word equal in a clause alleging the condition into which all men, meaning a species rather than a gender, are created. In logic, such a term needs a referent. One must ask, equal in what respect? Implicitly, according to the Declaration, in respect of civil capacity. Yet that thought seems belied by a later reference to merciless savage Indians. For how could so invidious a phrase be used if all were civilly equal? The text does not articulate the distinction between equality as a concept for dealing out justice between incommensurable human beings, to use Jacques Barzun's apt phrase, and equality taken as a circumstance bestowed by nature, so that any demonstrable disparity becomes proof of deviancy and injustice. I wish also the document had been more precise about linkage between equality and liberty, both terms occurring in the same sentence. Obvious in logic, neither abstraction can be considered absolute in coexistence with the other. I just wish the Declaration had more to say about the tension between these two ideas. My last such point concerns an appeal in the Declaration for support among people of informed judgment in certain other lands. Jefferson dressed up the idea in words about a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. The new etiquette, of course, would require personkind. I shall let that point pass. A significant shade of distinction obtains between judgment and opinion. Mankind in such a context is a phantom notion. In Spengler's word again, mankind has no more goal, purpose, or plan than the species butterfly or orchid. Mankind is either a zoological concept or an empty word. The phrase in the Declaration humors illusions about finding wisdom in amorphous aggregates and contributes to a fallacy, if I may quote the late Dean Acheson, of feeling obligated to turn on a wind machine because others want to whip up a cyclone. I deplore it, as I deplore other loose phrases, for encouragement given to sentimentality in international affairs.
From the Benjamin Franklin Auditorium in the State Department, Dr. Charles Burton Marshall has been discussing the historical development of America's foreign policy. He continues in one moment. One of the most beautiful of all Washington's embassies is that of Japan. The embassy itself was built in 1932 in a modified American colonial style, but you can't tell an embassy by its exterior. The grounds of the embassy are authentic and traditional reproductions of Japan. Most spectacular is the Japanese tea house. All the structural and decorating materials used in the tea house and its grounds were brought here from Japan, even the fine gravel in the sand garden. The gardens are landscaped in true Oriental tradition, with the vegetation and artifacts designed to induce a mood of solitude and meditation. More colorful is the beautiful fish pond. The pond is stocked with $10,000 worth of carp, specially bred for their colors. The rocks surrounding the pond are lava formations imported from Japan. The low point in Japanese-American relations, the period of World War II, is one of the matters Dr. Charles Burton Marshall will discuss as he continues his lecture from the State Department.
In successive seminars in recent years, I've had my students, as one assignment, Scan the Declaration. Single out the postulates, precepts, and nuances bearing on the nature of public life and the good of the state, and see what ones they accept as plausible. In surprising proportions, the students prove never to have read the document before, profess to finding it fascinating, surprising, and express skepticism about the assumptions and expectations reflected in it. Well, it's not necessary to go so far back as the Declaration to find a point of reference for making a modest test of altered mood. A similar process applied to President John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, which impressed so many with its elan and affirmativeness only 13 years ago, has produced like results. It sounds like something from another century, was one student's judgment. One sees implicit here a retreat from certainty, a phenomenon which Alan Wheelis ponders in his book, The End of the Modern Age. At the beginning of the modern age, science did indeed promise certainty, Wheelis writes. It does no longer. Sir John Squire has expressed the same thought. He quotes from Alexander Pope, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." He adds, "It did not last. The devil, howling, 'Ho, let Einstein be,' restored the status quo." Wheeler sums up the difference. Certainty, he says, leads us to attack evil. Being less sure, we would but resist it. My closing remarks are personal observations, appropriate for a time of doubt. I do not share the current mood, mainly because I have never participated in high hopes for the finite, fallible aspects of existence called policy. As far back as I can remember, I would have concurred with Herbert Butterfield's thought. I quote him, "And we of the 20th century have been particularly spoiled, for the men of the Old Testament, the ancient Greeks, and all our ancestors down to the 17th century betray in their philosophy and their outlook a terrible awareness of the chanciness of human life and the precarious nature of man's existence in this risky universe. These things, though they are part of the fundamental experience of mankind, have been greatly concealed from recent generations because modern science and organization enabled us to build up such a tremendous barrier against fire, famine, plague, and violence. The modern world created so vast a system of insurance against the contingencies and accidents of time that we imagined all the risk eliminated, imagined that it was normal to have a smooth going on, and that the uncertainties of life in the past had been due to mere inefficiency. Like Othello, I can say I have done the state some service. He could add, and they know it, mine was obscure. In that spirit, had I been alive in revolutionary times, I probably would have regarded the more buoyant asseverations in the Declaration as skeptically as in my own time I have regarded the promissory frills with which our magistrates are wont to bedeck their initiatives in foreign policy. Rather than Jeffersonian enthusiasms, I fancy I would have shared John Adams' pessimism along with his grasp of the essence of independence, to which he was devoted no less than his more sanguine compatriots, and also his love for country. The essence of the Declaration was and is in the phrase about assuming among the powers of the earth this separate and equal station. The heart of the Declaration, the action part, concerned power. A brilliant chapter in Professor Byland's book on the ideological origins of the American Revolution delineates anxieties of power among the protagonists of that revolution. Power, nevertheless, was what they sought and what they used intrepidly in the seeking. I stress the point because one hears in these times so much vain counsel to the nation about perils of power and the wisdom of shedding it. thrice in recent months I have heard Lord Acton's famous aphorism invoked and inevitably misquoted in support. Acton's phrase is not power corrupts, it is power tends to corrupt, to which he added an absolute power corrupts absolutely. True, power can be misused. The possessors may mistake means for ends, abandon perspective, and end up done in by their own instruments. Acton, however, did not impute such perversion solely to power. He never said only power corrupts. Courage can be overdone to foolhardiness, pride to pridefulness, thrift to greed, generosity to improvidence, trust to gullibility, faithfulness to folly, humility to supineness, charity to degradation. What virtue is immune to vice? Shakespeare wrote of a man destroyed by loving too possessively, Goethe of a man put in eternal peril by excessive thirst for knowledge, Hardy of a man undone by overweening desire to be right, and Kipling of a man who overdid the very idea of not overdoing. Sovereignty, though not in the text, also sums up the goal of the Declaration. How many times over the years have I heard someone in an audience, using a tone of discovery, suggest abandonment of sovereignty so as to abolish danger and achieve concord? Sovereignty is merely an abstract expression for a finite government's possession of resources and faculties for coping. It derives from having a scheme of authority capable of maintaining dependable social order, command of the allegiance of a determining portion of the population encompassed, common recollections and expectations sufficient to form a bond of identity among that portion, a conscious general purpose to amount to something significant in the world's annals, capacity and will to command means and to devote them to realizing common preferences and to enter into and effectuate external obligations, capability to affect environing conditions also, as well as to be affected by them, and a system of agency able to represent the realm by communicating authentically and conclusively on its behalf to others beyond its span. Which of these would any sound person wish the nation to give up? These faculties and qualities are hard to come by. They are no fixed reality, no inherent endowment. We could forfeit any of them at peril. If we should ever lose them, we can only say, quoting Spengler, world politics destroys those countries that are not up to it. My final thought is about love of country. On a speaking occasion a few years ago, I was charged by a certain publisher in the audience with advocating the principle of my country, right or wrong. I did not deny it. I only demurred. The authentic words of Stephen Decatur's aphorism are, our country, in her intercourse with other nations, may she always be in the right, but right or wrong, our country. The first part is Decatur's prayer for national perfection. The second comes to terms with the human situation. As I told the accusatory publisher, I might say the same for my family, wishing my children perfect, but knowing they will not be, will err, and will get into trouble. When that happens, should I renounce them? No. Then should I do otherwise for the society of which I have been beneficiary and the land which is the scene of my best recollections? Moreover, one must recognize the elements of tragedy in the human situation. What constitutes tragedy is that human beings and human institutions, facing an indifferent universe, indifferent to their hopes and to their values, may get done in for their virtues as well as by their vices. Any tragedy which besets this society, this state, this government, all of them fallible, finite, contingent, will not spare me. In that sense, it is my country, right or wrong.
We've been listening to Dr. Charles Burton Marshall discussing foreign policy as a dimension of the American Revolution. Dr. Marshall traced the development of America's foreign policy from the days of the Revolution up to the present times. This lecture has been one in a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute dealing with the American Revolution and how it still affects us all today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Marshall's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute. That's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C., 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.